Linear equations, connecting equations to graphs. What is the template for a linear equation? A linear equation can be written in the format y equals mx plus b, where m represents the slope of the graph, and b represents our y-intercept or our starting point. In this video, we'll be using an equation to create a line on the graph, and then we'll be going backwards where we use a graph to find the equation. Problem 1. Here we have the equation y equals 5 over 3x minus 6. Taking a look at the equation, which part refers to the slope? Locating our x, we know that the coefficient, the number in front of x, is going to be our slope. So this has a slope of 5 over 3. Let's break down the slope even further. Which part of the slope refers to the change in y? We know that the change in y is located on top of the ratio, so our change in y is going to be 5. And that means the number on the bottom of our ratio is going to be our change in x. So 3 is our change in x. Looking back at the equation, which part refers to our y-intercept? Notice that we have this constant 6 that is by itself. So 6 is going to be our y-intercept. But we need to be careful. Notice that there's a minus sign here. So our starting point is actually going to be at negative 6. So now that we analyze the parts of our equation, let's go ahead and make a graph. We know that our y-intercept is at negative 6. So on the y-axis, we're going to start at negative 6. We'll put our first dot here. We know that our change in y is 5. So our up and down change from our starting point, we're going to move up 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're going to go up plus 5. We see that our change in x is 3. So we're moving to the side plus 3. 1, 2, 3. So from our starting point, we know we're going to move up 5 over 3. So this is where our next point is going to be. Now that we have our 2 points, we can draw a line through this graph. And this is going to be our linear equation. Problem 2, we have the equation y equals negative 2x plus 4. Which part of the equation is the slope? Locating our x, the coefficient, the number in front of x, is going to be our slope. So we have a slope of negative 2. Let's break down our slope even further. What's going to be the change in y? Our change in y is going to be negative 2. Now let's go ahead and think about what our change in x is going to be. Notice that this does not have a denominator. So if there's no denominator, we can assume that this is over 1. Because negative 2 divided by 1 is negative 2. So our slope can be broken down to negative 2 over 1. Looking back at our equation, which part refers to our y-intercept? Notice that we have this constant 4 by itself. So our y-intercept is going to be at 4. Now we have all the parts we need to graph our line. So let's go ahead and graph. Taking a look at our graph, we know that our y-intercept is at 4. So looking at our y-axis, we're going to put our first point at 4. We know that our change in y is negative 2. So from our starting point, we're going to count down 2. And we see that our change in x is 1. So we're going to be moving over 1. So to place our new dot, from our starting point, we're going to go down 2 over 1. And this is where our new point is going to be. And now that we have our 2 points, we can draw a line through these 2 points. And that's going to be the graph for our line. Problem 3, we're going to be going backwards. Here we're starting with our graph, and we're going to try to figure out what our linear equation is going to be. Let's start with our y-intercept. Looking at our graph, when does the line cross the y-axis? Notice that it crosses the y-axis right here at 0, 2. So we know that our y-intercept, our starting point, is going to be at plus 2. Now let's try to figure out what our slope is going to be. Before we can do that, we need to figure out what are some clear points on the line. I see that we have a couple of clear points here at negative 2, negative 4, negative 1, negative 1, and at 1, 5. Now that we have some clear points, we can draw our change in y. From our starting point to the next point, how much are we rising up? Our change in y is going to be plus 3. What's our change in x going to be? From this dot to the next, we're moving to the side 1 space. So our change in x is plus 1. So how do we write our slope? What number goes on top of our slope? We know that the change in y goes on top, so we're going to write 3 on top. And we're going to put the change in x on the bottom. So the equation for this graph is going to be y equals 3 over 1x plus 2. Problem 4. Looking at the graph, how can we write an equation? Let's start by figuring out what our y-intercept is. So looking at the y-axis, when does the line cross the y-axis? It looks like it crosses the y-axis right here at 0, negative 1. So our equation is going to start at minus 1. Now we want to figure out our slope, but before we can do that, we should find some clear points on the line. I see that there's one point here at negative 3, 3, and I see one more point here at 3, negative 5. Now that we have some clear points, we can go and find our slope. From our starting point to the next point, what's our change in y? Looks like we're going 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces, but since we're going down, our slope is going to be negative 4. Now what's our change in x going to be? Moving to the side, we're moving over 3, so our change in x is plus 3. So how do we write our slope? What goes on top of our slope? We know that change in y goes on top, so we have negative 4 on top. And we know that change in x goes on the bottom, so 3 is going to go on the bottom of our ratio. So the equation for this line is going to be y equals negative 4 over 3x minus 1. Going from an equation to a graph, we know that the constant value by itself is going to be our y-intercept, or our starting point. And we know that the slope is going to be the coefficient next to x, which is going to tell us our rise and run. So starting with our b value, we're going to move over the slope, and that's going to help us find our next point. And from these 2 points, we can draw a line.